Barely a year after Venezuela became home to the world's largest oil reserves, the South American country experienced an era of remarkable growth. Its economy flourished, attracting thousands of immigrants who wanted to be a part of the nation's wealth. Venezuela rose to become the fourth richest nation in the entire world, surpassing even the famous United Kingdom. But as they say, every rise has its fall, and Venezuela was no different. The nation soon found itself on the brink of collapse. Its once vibrant economy crumpled massively, surpassing the depths of the United States during the Great Depression. The effects were terrible. A population of almost 32 million people struggled to get access to food, while hospitals that lacked important resources like antibiotics and soap went through unbelievable challenges. But what was the reason behind this economic nightmare? Can this once prosperous nation rise from the depths of misery and reclaim its past glory? This is the story of Venezuela, the strongest economy on planet Earth and the most terrible economic disaster in recent times. It was July 31st, 1914. Venezuela, a nation largely unknown to the world, experienced a remarkable event that would change its destiny forever. Deep within a large 400-foot hole, a breathtaking sight unfolded as a thick, black, and vicious liquid broke out. This became the birth of Venezuela's first commercial oil well. And little could anyone understand the influence this discovery would have on the nation. At the time, Venezuela was an alien country ruled by Juan Vincent Gomez, a dictator who never let an opportunity pass him by. When he was vice president, he forcefully took over the presidency from then-President Cipriano Castro, who was being treated for syphilis in France. From then on, he became a much-dreaded dictator until his death. Also, the discovery of massive oil reserves was a vital way through which he strengthened his power. Taking advantage of the lack of resources and expertise, Gomez allowed foreign companies to explore and extract Venezuelan oil without taxes or royalties. However, they had to keep supporting his regime. Gomez granted oil favors, promoted loyal alliances, and built a network of people whose prosperity was linked to oil revenue, which further strengthened his grip on power. At the end of the day, he had gathered a ton of personal wealth and set Venezuela on a new course. In the next 21 years, the country experienced a remarkable transformation, getting rid of its mysteriousness to become the world's second largest oil producer. Venezuela was transformed from an unknown nation to an important player on the world stage. The nation developed a strong reliance on oil money, which accounted for 2/3 of the government's income and a whopping 90% of its exports. While Juan Vincent Gomez prioritized his interests and those devoted to him. At the same time, normal Venezuelans had their first taste of the impressive benefits enjoyed by the dictator through oil. It was a time of new beginnings for the people of the country. The very first banks to emerge, and the oil industry offered big wages, paving the way for the already thriving economy to flourish. In the quest to share the abundance of wealth, Venezuelan farmers left behind their traditional lands and moved to the cities. The timing couldn't have been better. As the need for oil continuously grew in the 20th century, the demand for Venezuela's currency, the bolivar, also increased. This was important for two key reasons. First, it made the importation of foreign goods much more affordable. On the other hand, the exportation of goods became more expensive. As a result, Venezuelan producers found themselves unable to export. During this period, consumers realized that buying foreign goods was the cheaper option. To complicate the situation further, the world was struggling with the Great Depression, which led the United States to weaken its dollar against other currencies. In just over a decade, the bolivar rose by 70%, becoming one of the strongest currencies in the world. For the first time in history, Venezuelans start importing luxury items, securing access to modern amenities, and securing decent jobs. However, the country was increasingly become over-dependent on oil. In the late 1930s, the effects of this over-reliance on oil became obvious. All business expenses, wages, and price of goods were tied to overvalued bolivar currency, which created a risky situation for the country's economy. As multitudes moved to the cities, cost of living sent shockwaves through the entire population. Even Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 32nd U.S. president, was surprised. He requested a careful review of the initial report he received on that matter. Surprisingly, Caracas had achieved the reputation of being the most expensive place to live on Earth in the late 1930s. The city began to look like a remote diamond mine, ruled with the iron fist of a dictator. By the time Gomez passed away in 1935, he had become one of the wealthiest people in Latin America. He owned large stretches of land and maintained monopolies in several industries, varying from paper production to dairy and beef. But that wasn't all. He created the country's first army to solidify his control. He also stopped opposition and granted the government power to seize all state revenues. Ironically, Gomez's death accidentally transformed the Venezuelan government into corporate entrepreneurs as they took control of this industrial empire. Nevertheless, Gomez's impact extended far beyond his time in power, shaping the governing style of every succeeding Venezuelan president. The beginning of the Second World War presented an incredible opportunity for the newly elected President Medina to engage in renegotiations with foreign oil organizations. In a daring move, Medina reached out to President Roosevelt, seeking his help in the matter. Understanding the importance of the situation, especially with Mexico having fully nationalized its oil a few years back, Roosevelt agreed to give his support. He even sent legal advisors to help the Venezuelan government during negotiations. The collective effort led to the enactment of an innovative oil law in 1943, known as the 50-50 principle. Under this law, Venezuela became equal partners in the oil industry, entitled to receive half of its oil profits. But there was a problem. Renowned lawmaker Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso discovered Venezuela's oil became less profitable compared to the oil from the Middle East. In response, Venezuela sent a committee to the Middle East equipped with translated versions of the 50-50 principle. It did not take long before these nations also embraced similar laws. This had a favorable effect on restoring huge profits to Venezuelan oil. However, Venezuela was not prepared for the hurdle they were about to face. At the end of World War II, oil demand increased. The Middle East experienced conflicts, including the closure of the Suez Canal in Egypt and the nationalization of Iran's oil industry. Venezuela prospered greatly from the rising oil prices and became the largest beneficiary of foreign currency during that decade. To answer public pressure, the government used the excess oil revenue to heavily subsidize gas prices. As a result, Venezuelans had the cheapest gasoline in the entire world. People from all walks of life wanted a significant share of that revenue, while the Venezuelan military emerged as an important player in the country's politics for many decades. After President Medina was removed from office, the country came under the rule of a civilian junta government. This era marked an important landmark with the introduction of universal suffrage and the first democratic election in the country. Unfortunately, this period was also short-lived. It happened that the military removed the newly elected Medina for the second time and replaced him with another dictator, Perez Jimenez. Just like Juan Vincent Gomez, Jimenez ruled Venezuela with an iron fist. He silenced opposition parties and dealt with his political enemies. In 1952, he rigged the election under the pretense of securing a more accurate count. Despite his brutal regime, Venezuela still experienced remarkable wealth. The country attracted several Western companies from across the world. Taxes were minimal, regulations were scarce, and a new wave of prosperous buyers emerged. As long as Jimenez's authority was unchallenged, you were free to conduct business as you pleased. Jimenez charted a successful future for Venezuela. With a staggering budget at his disposal and no obstructions in his way, he pursued big ambitions. In a few years, the country was renamed the Republic of Venezuela. Also, state-owned heavy industries were built, and ambitious public works programs were introduced. Jimenez believed he could move Venezuela into an advanced future by using the best resource in his hands, money. New houses were built for citizens who couldn't afford them. Several schools and hospitals flourished across the nation, and extensive highways cut across the country, connecting different regions like never before. During this period, the people of Venezuela enjoyed remarkable prosperity. It was October 1973. The world of petroleum geopolitics was once again shaken to its core. For nearly 6 months, the West's support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War led to a complete oil embargo by Arab-producing countries. Oil prices increased to $14 per gallon. During this period, Venezuela found itself getting 3 times its normal oil profits. The country's former oil minister, Perez Alfonso, warned that this massive inflow of wealth would be a burden for the country, with everyone trying to get their hands on the money. True to his words, the abundance of wealth proved too much for Venezuelans to deal with. In a short time, the nation quickly got into the state of emergency. Administrators worried that the huge increase in funds would lead to unmanageable inflation. President Perez responded by raising wages, increasing social spending, and informing the government to create jobs by any means possible. It was a desperate attempt to manage the situation and avoid economic problems. However, the situation didn't get any better. For instance, it became a law that elevators and public bathrooms must have attendants. In spite of this, the rate of inflation was rapidly increasing, reaching 12% per year. By 1974, the people of Venezuela realized keeping their money in banks meant losing it quickly. On the other hand, banks were told to keep loan rates low, making it a huge temptation to spend your savings and take out loans instead. The country's middle class amounted to 58% of the entire population. As many of them prospered, they didn't fully understand the vulnerability of their economy and weren't prepared for the dark days. On their part, the government tried to organize a savings fund for surplus oil revenue, which failed miserably. The public sector grew significantly as the government dialed out jobs to about 300,000 people. In addition, a bill that prevented organizations from firing workers despite higher wages became law. Large companies depended on generous state subsidies to stay profitable. For small businesses, they went bankrupt without support from the state. Surprisingly, only 9% of the largest businesses produced 75% of all goods, which created an imbalanced economy. Also, the president began the nationalization of the oil industry, putting a deadline for 1983. This decision made oil companies stop investing well before the deadline. The 1980s became the beginning of Venezuela's death spiral. By 1988, oil prices had dropped significantly. Unfortunately, the effect of this decline wasn't a calculated risk and therefore unexpected. As a result, several companies heavily depended on support from the government. Consumers battled with overpriced currency. Several jobs were unproductive even though they were created by the state. The steady inflow of money barely 2 decades ago became trickles. The government refused to withdraw or reduce its funding, resulting in a massive increase in debt. The new president, Luis Herrera Campins, quadrupled the foreign debt before deciding to make use of the oil fund. The state-owned oil and gas company Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA, also had its savings emptied by the president. In a few years, the flow of dollars that maintained the Venezuelan economy began to decrease rapidly. To address this problem, President Campins devalued the bolivar currency on February 18, 1983, a day that became known as Black Friday in Venezuela. Having the majority of the citizens' everyday commodities being imported, the unexpected increase in the cost of living became unaffordable for Venezuelans. And to avoid a mass withdrawal of foreign currency, President Campins imposed capital controls and created 2 fixed exchange rates, 4 to 3 to 6 bolivars per dollar. This new policy was regulated by a new organization called richest. Venezuela, which had become dependent on the global market, now struggled to pay up its debts. This problem continued as oil prices remained stagnant and low. Inflation was on a steady rise, causing Venezuelans to stop saving money because its value had reduced rapidly. In these moments of chaos and manipulated exchange rates, people turned to corruption, bribery, and the black market to make a living for themselves. Government officials also took advantage of favorable exchange rates for dollars and made massive profits, selling them on the black market. And as a result of price control on food, people started to hoard and buy more than was needed, fearing future shortages. However, as prices remained fixed and scarcity increased, Venezuelans took to selling the excess goods illegally or smuggling them to neighboring nations. In 1988, Venezuela's entire economy was reduced by 10%, and in contrast to his campaign promises, President Perez carried out extreme measures to avoid economic collapse. The problem was, it happened all at once. The government stopped paying debts, abolished richest, lifted price controls, raised the prices of gas, and reduced social spending. Consequently, the Venezuelan currency lost about 60% of its value, and gas prices doubled almost immediately. Violent protests broke out, resulting in the loss of hundreds of lives as the military suppressed them. The number of Venezuelans living in poverty increased by tenfold between 1981 and 1989. The extent of government corruption was glaring to the people. Former presidents faced challenges of embezzlement, and foreign companies benefited from the bribing richest. Despite the chaos, Venezuelans failed to understand the economic significance of saving and investing in oil wealth. From their perspective, life was better under authoritarian dictators. That's why, in February 1992, the The people cheered when the mysterious paratrooper attempted a socialist military coup against their democratically elected government. In 1992, the coup attempted by Hugo Chavez failed, but among the poor, he gained popularity as a symbol of anti-corruption. After he was released by the next president, Rafael Caldera, Venezuela's economic problems worsened over the next 6 years. A banking disaster occurred, causing a huge loss in GDP and uncontrolled inflation reaching over 100%. As a result, the demand for change was popular, and Chavez emerged as a rising political figure. In 1998, he was elected with a promise to stop the decades of corruption. Born without a silver spoon, Chavez rose through the military ranks by fighting leftist guerrillas in the 1970s. However, he developed leftist beliefs and established a secret organization with other military officers who were in support of a socialist government in Venezuela. During the time of his election, nearly half of all Venezuelans lived in severe poverty. Corruption was common, and inequality was at its highest. Chavez claimed to encourage democracy and promised to respect private property. But at the same time, he had developed an admiration for Fidel Castro and socialist Cuba. He even hosted Castro's 75th birthday celebration. Desperate for change, voters gave Chavez the power to rewrite the entire constitution. This resulted in the establishment of a new Congress filled with many of his supporters. He renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and started what was referred to as the Bolivarian Revolution. In 2001, Chavez implemented 49 new laws. The laws helped the state to seize land and break up large agricultural estates. But this was just the beginning. A new petroleum law was passed to improve state involvement in the oil industry. Despite being state-owned, the National Oil Company, PDVSA, operated somewhat independently from the political system. And to attract much-needed capital and expertise, the company welcomed foreign companies under favorable terms. But this new development was criticized as a hidden form of privatization. This was because foreign forces still had considerable control over the country's oil. Chavez's intervention in Venezuela's oil industry provoked protests and triggered a failed coup. Thousands of PDVSA employees joined a total strike, resulting in a 2-month pause in oil production. Venezuela lost billions in oil revenue during this period. In retaliation, Chavez dismissed nearly 20,000 employees, which he branded enemies of the state. To further secure his control over currency exchange, he reintroduced exchange controls and established Khedive, a similar institution to Recalde. He implemented price controls and encouraged banks to provide cheap loans to boost the economy and avoid inflation. Well, with the rebirth of high oil prices in the 2000s, Venezuela started experiencing economic stability. In 2008, thriving global demand for commodities driven by countries like China led to a huge increase in oil prices by 600%. But instead of saving oil revenues for a possible future decline in the economy, Chavez used up the oil wealth in funding his socialist ambitions. A few months later, he introduced several social programs known as missions. They provided subsidies for food, housing, and jobs for the poor. The improved economic conditions allowed Venezuelans to enjoy a better quality of life, which also led to increased consumer spending and a sense of prosperity, just like in the 1970s. Chavez also pursued his vision of 21st century socialism. He took over major industries and raised taxes on foreign countries. He declared an economic war against what he saw as ruthless neoliberal capitalists. Chavez believed that these foreign capitalists were to blame for the economic crisis and not the government's mismanagement of oil revenue. He believed inflation was a strategy by others to exploit Venezuela, and it wasn't a basic economic principle. Under Chavez, Venezuela received the highest oil revenue in the world, with 90% of its profits going to the state. How the money was spent wasn't the concern of foreign oil companies. The economic prosperity wasn't even due to Venezuela's newly created policies, but rather the high oil prices. But as we have seen, Chavez didn't save the oil revenue. He created weak government-owned companies, neglected productive economic policies, and didn't develop the agricultural sector. Chavez limited the inflow of dollars, which led to a thriving black market. Foreigners paying the official exchange rate had to spend over $2,000 per night in hotels. However, the black market offered rates were low as $50. In an attempt to let Venezuelans travel abroad, they were allowed to trade their bolivars for $2,000 once a year. Whatever money they didn't spend during the trip was smuggled back home and sold in the black market. This earned them 7 times the yearly minimum wage. Growing up in a struggling economy, future Venezuelans had developed an inaccurate understanding of money and economics. With the rising inflation, Venezuelans took loans and purchased anything they could before the price increased further. They also took advantage of the declining value of money. But while they were faced with food scarcity, they preferred buying luxury items like satellite TVs and electronics. Well, everything changed when a huge crisis occurred, the biggest ever in the history of the nation. In 2008, Venezuela faced its biggest setback as oil prices dropped. 6 years later, it declined even further. As a result, the country struggled to import essential resources it depended on. Unlike other oil-rich countries that saved money and diversified their economies, Venezuela wasn't prepared for such a massive economic crisis. The country couldn't produce enough food to sustain itself, leading to a crumbling economy. This terrible situation has forced thousands of Venezuelan citizens to leave the country, while many are still suffering from starvation. By 2019, inflation had reached an unbelievable 65,000 percentile. This is significantly higher than the worries of the Americans with their inflation rate at 5%. Following Chavez's footsteps, Maduro took over the country's presidency and continued to destroy what is left of democracy. Meanwhile, the people of Venezuela have continued to endure even greater hardships than before they discovered oil. The story of Venezuela's economy is a perfect reminder that mismanaging excessive wealth and resources can be more damaging than having no money at all.